Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's webinar series. My name is Marissa Smith, and I'm the Director of Student and Recent Alumni Engagement for the Alumni Association, and I'm super glad that you have all joined us this afternoon. For those of you in Minnesota, I hope you're staying warm and inside. It's truly coming down out there, and so hope that you're all staying safe. And if you are joining us from somewhere else, I hope that the weather is treating you okay there as well. Before we turn it over to our presenter for resume refresh, I just have a couple announcements to make. First, I want to give a shout out to our Alumni Association members. It's through their support that we're able to keep this alumni webinar series going. So thank you to our members. And if you're interested in learning more about joining the Alumni Association, you can visit us at umnalumni.org/membership. We also have a supporting sponsor for the webinar series this year. That's Liberty Mutual Insurance. Want to thank them for their support. And then also, this webinar is part of a month-long series of career topics we're calling Career Month. And we still have one more webinar coming up on February 28th, Discover Your Career Language with Maggie Thomas of the Carlson School's Graduate Business Career Center. So if you're interested in continuing your professional development with Career Month, definitely feel free to join us on February 28th. And for those of you who haven't joined us before, just want to give you a couple of housekeeping tips on GoToWebinar. So you've joined the webinar using your computer speakers as a default, but you also do have the option to join over your telephone. So if you'd prefer to do that, go to the audio pane of your GoToWebinar control panel and dial-in information will be displayed. If you're having any issues with the connection, that can sometimes be caused by having multiple software applications open. So you can go ahead and close out of any unnecessary applications, and that usually resolves any issues that you might be having. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar. I know our presenter has reserved some time at the end to address your questions. So you can submit those using the questions panel on your GoToWebinar control panel. So definitely feel free to submit those anytime. We'll be monitoring them as we go. And with that, it's time to introduce our featured speaker today. We have Tara Dillon, who's a career coach at the Carlson School's Undergraduate Business Center. And Tara has over 7 years of experience in career advising at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And she's supported diverse students and alumni across many colleges, majors, and industry areas. Tara is an alumna of the university herself, which is exciting. She holds an MA in counseling and student personnel psychology from the College of Education and Human Development at the U, and a BA in communication studies from the Youth College of Liberal Arts. So we're very pleased to welcome Tara, and I'm just going to turn our presentation over to her. So just give us one moment here while we make the switch.
All right, hi everyone. As Marissa mentioned, I'm Tara Dillon. I'm a career coach at the Carlson Undergraduate Business Career Center. I'm so glad to be with all of you today to talk about refreshing your current resume draft. As Marissa was mentioning at the top, if you are in Minnesota, I was laughing to myself that I feel like just like listing being a Minnesotan in winter could definitely be on your resume, and all the skills that are involved with that, especially on days like today and all the adaptability. So thanks for being here. I know that we have a diverse group joining us today in terms of industry areas, experience levels. We have everything from current students to really seasoned professionals. So wherever you happen to fall on that spectrum, know that this content, you will find nuggets that are really salient for you, and also that we're going to be covering kind of general resume content that applies to any industry, knowing that there's nuances that might apply to your industry segment and also your experience level. So as we get going here, I fully encourage you to grab or pull up your current resume draft so you can reference it, maybe thinking about notes you want to make, changes you might want to implement. And then as Marissa shared, please feel welcome to send your comments and questions via the chat window throughout, knowing that we'll save the bulk of kind of the answering of those for the end of the session. Here's kind of a roadmap for where we're going today. So we're going to start with some grounding context that I think is important for all resume writers to have. And then we'll jump into resume strategy, starting with formatting, talking about organization of content and experiences, and then more specifically diving into how you describe your experiences strategically on your resume. And the order of these chosen intentionally based on how a reader interacts with your document. So we will talk about that throughout. So let's get going with grounding context, the things that we all need to think about together as we are updating our drafts. The first piece as we start this conversation is really thinking about what is the purpose of this document? How is it going to function for us? What do we want it to do in the world? And I think of our resume as a marketing tool. It's one tool within your job search kit that you use to communicate your professional identity. Resumes are used for many things. And again, depending on where you are experience-wise, some or more of all of these might apply to you. I think the primary application, especially for our user group, is for internship or job applications. We also know these can be used for scholarships, for grants, for grad school applications. But the job and internship search strategy is going to be the primary focus of our discussion today. And also knowing that the content of your resume can be used and repurposed in other ways. So maybe thinking about how do these strategy tips apply to updates I want to make to my LinkedIn? Is this beginning cover letter content? How can I fold some of these strategic pieces into the way I present myself in interviews? So it kind of builds on itself as we go throughout the job search process. But because this is primarily a marketing tool, one of the first things we need to think about and talk about when crafting our resume document is audience. Who are we writing this for? Really engaging with empathy. How will this person interact with this document? What is important to them? And our primary audience here is human beings, right? The recruiters or the hiring managers or the networking referrals that are going to be interacting with our resume. We also know that we have a secondary audience, which is applicant tracking software. So I want to make sure that I call that out. Many organizations are now using an online platform of some kind to help filter candidates. And we're primarily going to be talking about that human audience today. The key with applicant tracking software is to know that it's scanning your resume for keywords. So you want to make sure that the language that's utilized in a job description is reflected in your document. But our primary audience today, again, is going to be the human being that either receives your resume right away or receives it after it's gone through that filtration process of an applicant tracking software program. So what's important to know about our audience? The main thing, the primary factor for me when I'm thinking about resumes is that this audience engages with your document in a very quick fashion. Most studies will say that a first scan of a resume is only 6 seconds long. Almost every study that I've seen comes down below 10 seconds, even though there's some variability there. But that means that the 6-second quick scan parameter needs to inform a lot of the choices that we're going to make related to format, content, strategy, organization. The other really salient pieces for me about the audience that we're writing for, okay, so we know they're reading this quickly, right? Whether it's 6, 10, in that short range. We also know that most readers are going to engage with your document from top down and left to right as they're scanning. And because of that time parameter, it's very important to a reader of a resume that they have a clean, consistent, and really easy to engage with organizational system of information. So that is where the formatting is going to become really important. If I am scanning this quickly, again, my eyes and my brain want something that I can see and go, I can interpret this information in a very fast manner. So those are some of the primary things that I think about when I am crafting a resume document with a student, working with an alum to think about, okay, what's really important to my audience here and how are they going to engage with that? Because of that, the first thing that we start with is formatting. That audience analysis leads us straight here. And in those first 6 seconds, this is the most important factor because a reader cannot take in all of your information in 6 seconds, right? So the visual appeal of it is the first thing that says, I'm going to engage with this or not. If your formatting is kind of funky or inconsistent or sort of visually displeasing in any way, the reader is not going to be encouraged to engage further after that initial scan. So it has to be on point in order to really encourage them to digest your actual content, the great info about your skills and your experiences, your education. So to illustrate this point to all of you, On the next slide, I'm going to put up a sample resume, and I will count out loud to 6 to simulate that first 6-second scan. This is an exercise that we do with our career skills classes, and I think it really illustrates that experience of what do I actually pay attention to in the first 6 seconds. So try to bring some awareness to where your eyes go on this document. What are your first impressions of this candidate in those 6 seconds? Are you encouraged to engage with this? Are you feeling disengaged? What do you notice? Okay, so again, I'll flash this resume sample up on the screen. I'll count to 6, and then I want you to be taking in what stands out to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, stop. Okay, so what I'm showing to you here is a teaching sample that we use in our career skills classes. This is a real student example resume. And again, as I shared, we have a high level of variability with the experience levels that are joining us, but the principles that are applying here apply to any resume document. So because we're thinking about formatting first, let's really dive into that. Some of the things that my students usually point out in class, I'm guessing are some similar things that really stood out to you in that first second review. So the first thing that they usually notice is alignment issues. We got some real funky things happening with the dates down here and also with other content items on this. And because the alignment is off, my brain goes, this looks disorganized. I don't want to engage further. It also starts an evaluative process of the candidate, right? So this is disorganized information. Perhaps I'm then interpreting that this candidate lacks a high degree of attention to detail, for example, right? So we know that there's an evaluative component that is also happening as the reader engages with the formatting and then further engages with your content. The second thing my students usually point out is that there is inconsistent locations of information. So you'll notice that this resume is primarily using a structure of section headers, so education experience on the left-hand side. But then as you're reading it, you find this actual experience listed here, right? We have a job title and an organization, and my brain again is going, this doesn't belong here, right? This is inconsistent, it's disorganized. My brain also really recognizes that there's one piece and only one piece of information that is underlined here. So anything that is novel will really make the reader's eyes focus there. And you want to be strategic about thinking, is the thing that I've underlined or bolded, italicized, is that where I want their attention to be going? We also have some capitalization inconsistencies happening here. And then this is a screenshot of a document, but this resume doesn't occupy the full page if you were able to see the full component. So blank space is another thing that my students usually recognize. We have a lot of blank space happening up in the header of this document. There's a lot of blank space because of that left organization of content sections. And so we want to be mindful of what blank space is usually interpreted as. Some blank space is really, really good. The reader's eyes needs a break, but if you have too much, it can also be interpreted as lacking experience, even though that's not the case. This person has a lot of experience. They haven't really flushed it out quite a bit yet. And then one other thing to note, on this particular sample, this experience with the Minnesota Youth Soccer Association takes up the bulk of this resume page, right? For any given resume, we only have 1 to 2 pages of content space. And I would say that most of our recruiting partners and what I see trend-wise, even for a very seasoned professional, they want you to cap that at 2. So thinking about that, that's not that much space to describe the value that you might be able to contribute, the experiences, the skills. But because on this resume sample, this person has given almost 1/4 of the page to this experience, as a reader, I interpret that they think this experience is their most related, their most valuable. And in this sample, this student is an accounting and supply chain major. I see in their activities section, they are a VP of operations for a student organization. They are a shift supervisor at Caribou Coffee. There's a ton of responsibility there, but the one they've flushed out the most and given the most real estate to may or may not be the most related experience. So looking at your own draft, think about the amount of real estate you're giving to an experience. And without even reading any content, that's already communicating information to the reader. So again, just wanting to bring some strategy and intentionality behind that. All right, so to give you a different sample, here's a visual that has more strategic and cleaner formatting for sure. Again, before taking in any actual content, this is more pleasing to the eye because my brain interprets that I could digest some of this information in a 6-second time period. And a few things that stand out to me, we have really specific and easy to find section headers. So this person has used all capitals. They also have a line going all the way across the page to say to the reader, here's one section of information. They also are utilizing a left to right organizational format here. So as we talked about with the audience, most people are going to engage with this from left to right. So this person has put the most important information in this context, the organization and the title of the experience, aligned on the left-hand side. I think this is a really traditional and strategic format to implement because of that. They also have minimized any formatting on the right-hand side because usually the dates and locations are not the most salient component of the experience. And if you were to format things over there, the reader's eyes will be drawn that way. And we really want them to stay on the left side where the most important information is. You can also see that this kind of left and right stack creates a bit of visual balance on the page. It creates some blank space between that organization title block and the date and location block. So this is a really traditional, again, I think, strategic format to implement. And then the other thing is the formatting is really consistent. So across the board, my brain really quickly can recognize, okay, bold is an organization, italics is a title. And that's implemented throughout the entire draft in terms of experiences. So that makes it really consistent for me as a reader. And again, my brain knows here's the organizational system. I can follow it quickly. I can digest this information quickly. So that's why the formatting becomes so important. You can also see that this resume better occupies a page. We have smaller font size happening here. And this student has no more experience than the one we were just looking at. They just have increased description spaces, right? And changed the formatting structure. But there's also some blank space here. So that's what I've just highlighted. For sure, I would recommend you get a full line space between each section. Your reader's eyes need that visual break to go, here's a chunk of information, here's a chunk of information. If you have the space, you can also incorporate a space between individual entries. So perhaps this person would incorporate a space between their volunteer tax preparer and their sales associate experience, knowing that you can control the size of that line space in Word, right? So if you highlighted the line, it doesn't have to be the default font size you're using. You can control that down to a size 3, and even just give that small visual break to the reader can be really effective. The two samples that I've just shown you are, really contextualized in the business context. I have already shared that. I'm currently housed in the Undergraduate Business Career Center. So those are our samples. Knowing that within industries, there's a lot of variability about what formatting and elements are common. So what you see here are two creative industry examples from my colleagues at Career and Internship Services, and they serve the College of Design. Their website is up on the page. They have a ton of samples across industry areas. They serve a really diverse population of students and programs. So this is a great resource to look for additional examples if that's helpful to you. So these visual samples have some additional elements in terms of color. There's branding elements on them. You see some icons implemented, but the same formatting principles that we just talked about apply here. So being mindful of where your reader's eyes are drawn, how they are engaging with your content, what is distracting, what is giving them that visual space that they need. So whether you're in a super creative space or operating in that more traditional business space in terms of formatting, those same principles can apply and enhance the reader's experience with your draft. A few other things to talk about formatting wise, again, based on the volume of resumes that I see, these are things that I have kind of created these kind of guidelines or rules for myself. So you have 1 to 2 pages of real estate, right? That is not a lot of space, especially if you're someone who has a robust set of experiences to draw from. So make strategic choices there. I would never recommend that you take your margins smaller than 0.5 or that you bring your font size below a 10, just for readability. And if you crowd the space that much with kind of gaming your margins, it can start to look pretty crowded. Think about using your bold and italics really strategically. My general rule is that you shouldn't have more than 2 elements of formatting on any given piece of content. So that means that if you are using all capitals and bolding, you probably also don't want that to be a different size. And for me, that just gets to kind of the cleanliness of the look of the formatting. Also, you don't usually need it, right? Like the bolding and the all caps does enough. So adding that extra element, I just don't think is necessary. And I would recommend, again, thinking about no more than 2 elements on any given piece of information. Make sure you're being mindful of blank space, using that strategically, incorporating it to help your reader's eyes. And then my general principle is that I want to draw and keep the reader's eyes towards the left of the document. So the bulk of my formatting elements would be found there. The other question that I get quite a bit about formatting is using templates or not. So to template or not to template, that is our question. This is a visual sample of the first template that Microsoft Word suggests to me when I open to create a new document. So I think it's called the chronological modern template. Some positives that I see to using templates are that they generally have, visual appeal. They're a really nice place to start if you are doing a big resume overhaul or if you're just getting started with your resume draft. Some of the drawbacks that I see to using these are that they give you usually very, very little control of the content organization and the formatting. They also usually have a ton of blank space. So you can see that here, and it can be hard to incorporate your level of experience onto a template. This one that you're seeing, this is a full page template, and it only has space for 2 experiences with description space of only 2 lines per experience. That is not enough usually to communicate your message in a strong way. Most recruiters have shared that they can spot a template like from a mile away. And that's true for me too. So being in a space where you're reviewing resumes all the time, if I receive this, I would instantly know that it came from a template program. It's also possible that you might be using the same template that somebody else is using in that resume stack. And so sometimes that can be perceived as a lack of effort, or it just takes away from the uniqueness of your look because they're seeing the exact same elements implemented elsewhere. My recommendation is to look at several templates and see if there's elements you can identify from that analysis that you really enjoy. So on this one, maybe I'm really drawn to the green font, or maybe I like how they're using all caps on the header sections, right? And those are the things I'm going to take from the template and incorporate into my own Word document so that I have more control of the formatting. And again, just moving forward, it can be less frustrating to invest the time up front versus using one of these to start and then having to change it later. So that's kind of my overall sense of templates. Some other quick formatting checks. So again, this is where I really encourage you to just take a look at your current draft and see how this is working for you. These are the most common catches that I make for students when I'm looking at theirs. So super small stuff, but it gets to kind of that cleanliness again. Check on the dashes between the dates on your resume. Microsoft Word will usually autocorrect, and I usually see one version of like the short, kind of thicker dash, and then another version of the thinner, longer dash. Usually people have that inconsistent. So choose whichever one you like and implement that across all dates on your resume. Also look for spacing. So same thing, dates are typically a place where I see this inconsistently, but also if there's any symbols on your resume, any slashes, things like that, make sure that you have either a space on each side or you have no space. We don't want to be in the situation of I have a space on one side of the date dash and not a space on the other. Again, just for that consistency. Be mindful of font selection. So in the business space, I think it's pretty common to use a serifed or footed font, like a Times New Roman. If you're in another industry segment, use a font that looks good to you. You can always Google like great resume fonts to use based on the industry that you're in, knowing that in that creative space, there's going to be a lot more liberty taken with font selection and other formatting elements. Check for consistent capitalization. Again, it just gets to cleanliness and it's an easy catch to make. And also for sure check in with alignment. Visually, that really stands out to us, just like I showed you on that first John Good resume sample that had some pretty funky alignment. That really can quickly create a zone of disorganization for the reader. And then the other one that I see, it's common for people to abbreviate dates on resumes to save a little bit of space, but you want to do that consistently. So if you are going to take January down to JAN to Jan, you also need to do that with June, right? So JUN, even though it's 4 letters, we still want to do that consistently just for cleanliness. So those are some quick things to check in with on your own draft, again, that I see really commonly based on the volume of resumes that come into my office. Okay, we have moved through formatting. So now let's get into content and how you can structure and organize your content and what to be thinking about there. What order pieces of information are found in and where they are found on the page is what we're going to focus on here. To start that, we need to revisit, just like we did with formatting, our audience parameters. So again, we're still operating in that 6-second zone. Your high-level organization plan really matters here because it informs the reader's experience with your document. And typically, we want to have the most relevant content toward the top and toward the left because we know that's how the reader is going to engage with your document. So what you are seeing here is some common resume categories. These may be the ones that are already represented on your draft, and you saw these on the samples that we looked at earlier. The order in which you list these sections and the titles that you're choosing to kind of label what those experiences are should be strategic based on what you're trying to market. Okay, again, remembering that the primary function of this is a marketing tool for you as a candidate. So what do you want the reader to see first? How do you want to position your experience are the main questions I want you to be asking as you're evaluating your own draft. And it's very typical to have 2 different experience sections. So you'll see under experience, I've got quite a variety of titles that can be used. Most often I see people leading with experience or related experience or something more targeted like communications experience or something like that. And then a secondary section that is also experience, but is just labeled or positioned in a different way, such as leadership or volunteer experience, things like that. Know that these experience sections do not have to be broken up into paid or unpaid experience. That's a really common question that I get from students and from alums. You have way more authorship and liberty over the organization of content. So if a volunteer experience or some form of unpaid experience is the most related content that you have to what you're trying to apply for, lead with that, right? That should be at the top of your experience section. So give yourself more freedom to take ownership of the organization, especially in that experience section. Resume conventions and norms say that within a section, positions should be listed in reverse chronological order. So that means that the most current experience is listed first. Again, that is what's typical, but you are the author and the editor here. So make a strategic choice based on what you're applying for. And then, of course, we want to be honest in your representation of the dates. But I've worked with students who had, an internship maybe 2 years ago that was the most related to what they're applying to now. And so they will intentionally not list things in chronological order, knowing that that's not the norm, but they're making a strategic choice in that way. So again, empower yourself to kind of really take ownership of what I want to market, what I want my reader to see first. Other notes here, most current students lead with their education section, but I want you to think about what's the main qualifications you are wanting to show for what you're applying for. So if you are a professional, a seasoned professional, your experience section is probably the most related content, and perhaps for you, your education section is the last section on your resume. Or again, perhaps you're operating in a really technical space and your technical skills section is the #1 qualification set that you want someone to see. So maybe technical skills is the first, experience is second, and then education follows. Again, really thinking about what your strategy is and allow that to inform the organizational structure. Other notes under additional options, a question that I get quite often is about a summary of qualifications section. I see those on professionals with substantial experience quite often. So this would look like at the top of your resume, summary of qualifications or a similar header title, and then maybe 3 to 5 bullet points that kind of summarize your experience or really call out specific things based on what you're applying for. If you are somebody especially that's using a 2-page resume and have a lot of experience to draw from, this can be an effective strategy for you. So worth thinking about, and good again to just give that a quick Google image search, summary of qualifications, and you can see some visual examples and decide if it's a fit for you or not. The other thing that I get questions about is the use of objective sections. So those are usually 1 or 2 statements, sentences at the top that would be like telling the person what you're applying for or giving maybe a couple skills of yours. I do not recommend using these. Again, my personal bias, I think that content space could be better utilized for something else. The objectives usually don't tell us enough to be highly valuable, and that information is likely covered in a cover letter, or it's obvious because you're using your resume to apply for something specific. And we assume that the objective of your resume is to get that position, right? So I think objectives maybe, several years ago were more common, but I would recommend moving away from those now. So again, something to think about as you look at your draft. Let's then talk about content within sections. So we have thought now about how we're going to overall organize, but within a specific content section, what you are seeing here is a sample education section, and those same organizational principles about engaging with our audience apply here. We want to think about relevance of content and allow that to inform the order. And then, especially for experience sections, we also want to think about redundancy. So are the skills, experiences I'm communicating being communicated by any other pieces of information on my resume? If yes, might I want to adopt something different or implement something different to highlight a different skill set? In this sample, you're seeing a difference in somebody leading with their degree title. So in the first one, we've got a Bachelor of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife, and that's bolded, right? So that's the first thing your eyes are going to see. It's the first line. It's got a formatting, drawing your eyes to it. In the second sample, this student is highlighting where they're studying versus what, right? They do have some format elements happening on their degree titles, but if you looked at that quickly, probably the number one thing you'd pay attention to is that they're studying at the U of M. And there's no right choice here, but again, asking yourself the question of what do I want somebody to see? Because the formatting will inform that primarily. So applying that question of relevance, of engaging with the audience to every piece of content on your resume, and especially within sections, can help you better strategically organize information. The other thing I wanted to call out in this section, this is actually a sample from a student that I was working with last week who had just wrapped up a media marketing experience and was getting ready to apply for another position. And the position they were wanting to apply for involved a great amount of digital content creation. And so I was looking at this draft and noticed that the person was listing last that they had experience with creating digital content, right? So even within an experience description, those same principles apply. In this case, the first bullet statement is about developing interpersonal skills, which is really important, right? That's a good skill to highlight, and I think it's a strategically written description. But for the position, we have to lead with the creation of digital content because that audience, that reader, is going to care about that most. And it's also more unique because many other candidates can talk about their interpersonal skills, right? But not every other candidate might have this set of experiences or skills. So reordering this to lead with digital content creation and bumping those interpersonal, more transferable skills towards the bottom is a change that this student decided to implement. Okay, so we have covered formatting, we've covered kind of high-level organizational decisions, and now let's get into how to actually describe your specific experiences. I think another working title for this section could be how to successfully write bullet statements, right? Because that's really what we're talking about, that type of content on your resume. And just a note here that from a formatting perspective, I really endorse actually using a bullet point. And I recommend using a solid one, okay? So like circles or squares usually look most clean. I would strongly evaluate using other symbols and wanting a full one because as I'm scanning a resume quickly, again, going back to that 6-second parameter, a solid bullet statement that is closely oriented to content allows a reader really quickly to go, that's one piece of information. It's a unit of information, and it's a chunk that's small enough that I can pay attention to it. So again, the formatting is applying here as well, right? Just like it has throughout all content on our resume, but I recommend you actually use a bullet statement. So for an individual description, this is kind of the process that myself and most other career professionals would recommend that you think through for crafting an individual description statement. So most typical to start with an action verb, followed by some additional information or skill information, and then ending with a result. So what was the outcome of the action that you're describing? You'll see some questions here to ask yourself. So with this example of designed, who was I designing for? What specifically was I designing? In what context was I doing that? Did I use a specific program or other skills to do that? And then how did my design have an impact would be how I would think about that process. And I sometimes find that trying to actually write for a resume can produce immediate writer's block, right? Many of you probably signed up for this because you're like, I know I need to describe my experiences, but how can I actually do that? And it's hard to get started. So what I would recommend for all of you is if you are feeling that resume writing block, either find someone that you trust and are comfortable with to have this conversation with, or simply just record yourself talking about what you do. And I want you to frame that conversation with yourself or with that other person under the guise of this person has no idea, no context for the position that you hold. Sometimes just talking about it openly and taking it out of the realm of I'm actually trying to write for my resume can really open up that creativity and help you get a fuller picture of what you actually do on a day-to-day basis, especially because you as a person doing the experience, you kind of lose some of the nuance because you're doing that activity all the time, right? So after you've recorded that, you can play it back and you will have naturally highlighted many verbs and skills in your description that you can then take note of, prioritize, see what you flushed out, and begin to kind of craft them from there. Here is an example of this kind of method in practice. So this is an example that draws upon a customer service experience. And thinking about the skills involved there, one of them primarily is communication, right, with other human beings. So leading with that action skill verb of communicated. Then thinking through those questions of who was I communicating with? What was I communicating about? What skills were involved there? And then what was the result of my communication? And so you'll see kind of that finished statement of communicated clothing and accessory product information to customers exceeding sales goals by 10%. And so again, taking that step-by-step method of starting with that verb, adding additional information that's necessary for context and to highlight skills, and then finishing with an impact statement, if possible, can really, really help as you're crafting these. I would also encourage you to focus strongly on your verb choice. So we want to be really mindful and strategic about verb choice in these descriptions because it's the first thing someone will see when they read about your experiences. That verb needs to be engaging because you don't know if the reader is going to take the time to actually read the full statement, right? So just like we talked about with formatting, this is kind of your lead. This is the hook that encourages them to read the rest. And I think that a verb should be able to stand on its own. And by that, I mean that it needs to be specific and communicate full information. An example of things to be on the lookout for, I see this quite commonly, is verbs like worked, which is too generic. It actually doesn't tell us any information by itself. I also commonly see phrasing like responsible for. So the example here, responsible for training of 10 team members. Think about if you have statements on your resume like that right now, or if that's the first thing that comes to mind, can you omit that filler phrase and just get straight to the verb that you actually wanted someone to know about? So in this case, trained 10 team members. That way, I can control that a reader is not going to disengage because they saw responsible for, right? When I really wanted them to know about my skill in training, I'm just going to lead with that. So again, focusing on your verb choice and getting right to the specific verbs right away. And then the last component that I would think about for description statements, these are 2 samples from our business career guide, and the focus here is on demonstrating impact. So strength of these statements is really in the quantification and the specific details. The numbers here, actually just from a formatting perspective, stand out to the reader's eyes instantly because they are recognizable as different than the content around it, right, than the characters around it. So adding quantifiable details from a formatting perspective is really strategic, but it also has a few other functions, such as understanding the magnitude of impact, and it gives you control over what the reader interprets about your experience. So in the second example, this person increased the followers on social media by 200. That impact is a way different than increasing it by 10, or on the other side, increasing by 1,000, right? So it gives some context, some specific context to your experiences. Another example, again, from a student experience lens, many students come in with experiences like perhaps running a camp, right? Or engaging in childcare experience, other things like that. So running a camp for 5 students versus 150 is a very different skill set. Training X number of people is a very different skill set depending on the magnitude. So numbers give context, and I just really encourage you to think, how can I quantify my experiences, whether it's the number of people involved, the percent increase of an impact. Those quantifiable details is the quickest way to really, really strengthen your experience descriptions. A couple other things, again, that really come into my office on a frequent basis. So questions about tense. My recommendation, and this is a most common resume convention, is that for ongoing experiences, you use present simple tense. So analyze, organize, execute, for example. And then if the experience has been completed, that you utilize past tense to describe those. So analyzed, organized, executed. I occasionally will also see students who use past tense across the board on their resume, whether it's ongoing or not, but I just don't see that as commonly. So I would recommend, again, if it's ongoing, present simple, if it's already completed, past tense. And then be mindful of punctuation consistency. Resume norm is that you're kind of writing in a short format, right? You're starting immediately with a verb. So I don't think punctuation at the end of those statements is necessary. If you want to include them, totally up to you. That's a fine choice as well, but just make sure that you do it consistently. So if one of them ends in punctuation, they should all end in punctuation. And then just going back to kind of our overall principle of keeping that audience in mind, you really want to be mindful of your real estate. So as we saw with that initial referee example, if you give an experience on your resume, 8 bullet points and everything else has 1, as a reader, I'm really going to interpret that you want me to pay attention to those 8 and that that's your most salient experience. So just being mindful of the number of description statements, how long they are. I would say probably max 2 lines for a description statement, again, just because of that 6-second parameter. Depending on the level of experience or the depth of description, it's okay to go beyond that. These are general guidelines, but if your description statement is longer than 2 sentences, I would encourage you to think about if that description could be broken up into 2 bullet points, because anything that looks like a paragraph of text, in a quick scan, your reader will totally disengage from. And then just like we looked at with that digital content creation example, being mindful of the order of your descriptions based on relevance to the position can help with the strategy of those. All right, so together today, we've come through resume formatting. We're taking our audience parameters into account. We've thought strategically about how we're going to organize content on our resumes in terms of sections, and then also in terms of content within each section. And we focused on describing individual experiences. So beginning with those strong verbs, adding our important details and results, and then quantifying when we can, when possible. I hope as a result of this conversation that you are feeling more empowered to refresh and of course continue to update your current resume draft as a result of our work together today. And I'm happy now to open this up for discussion and for additional questions.
Thank you so much, Tara, for all of those wonderful and helpful suggestions. I know that I had a really easy time following along with your discussion, and some of the questions that have been submitted by participants already were already addressed in your presentation, which I think is a great thing.
Awesome.
But there are a few that have come in, so I will toss them over to you. One of them is about project-based work.
Yes.
This person indicates they've done project-based work in several jobs. Should they include projects under their job experience or in a separate section?
So a couple things I would think about if I was kind of fielding this question in person. So if the project-based work is contextualized under one organization, like you were an employee of X organization and took on multiple projects, I think it's most strategic to list that under that experience because it helps the reader know where that experience was coming from. And you can list them individually if you want to, but I also wonder if they could be communicated just with a simple description statement. Sometimes, and this is especially the case for students who are building experience or for people who are doing perhaps multiple different contracting creative projects, it makes sense to have a standalone project experience section where you would include some formatting elements on the title of the project. You can give the specific date range of that project and then more call it out with specific verbs. So I think either choice is fine. And I would just encourage the person who submitted this question to think about how much specificity, you want to give to your projects and visually how you want a reader to interact with them. Putting them in their own section will be way more of a call out than me as a reader having to dig into like the third bullet statement of a position. So those are some of the things I would think about as you make that decision.
Great. Another question came up during your presentation, but they're asking it a little bit more specifically. And it's, at what point in my career, if any, do I move my education to the bottom of my resume? This person's currently 2 years into their job.
Sure. Yep. So again, going back to that question of where do I want somebody to focus the most? I don't think there's any hard and fast rule, but I would say that I most commonly see alums that are in that sort of like 2 to 5-ish years range of experience moving their education below their experience. Depending on the breadth of your experience or again, what you want to highlight, I also see students implement that right after they graduate and have obviously completed a first position and then are looking for their second position. I think probably again that 3 to 5-ish range is a good ballpark guideline. But as I mentioned, I actually have current students who lead with their technical skills section because that's the most salient component. So really empowering you back to think about what do you want someone to see first and making the decision from there. I will say that if you are a current undergrad student or a current graduate school student. So even for our MBA students, many of them lead with their education because that's the main qualification they're bringing to their new position. But again, wanting you to evaluate based on what you want the reader to see first and what feels like the best thing you want to apply with, lead with that.
Right. There's been a couple of questions that relate to having multiple positions for one company.
Sure.
Do you have any suggestions on the best way to format multiple positions? One of the questions relates to someone that had an internship and then came back after some time finishing school for a full-time job. Another one is just asking about multiple positions within the same company.
Yeah, so 2 options that I see. One, of course, is to list them separately within an experience section. If especially you have been like chronologically promoted or changed positions within an organization, so there's not a date break between those two, then I would also see that commonly listed under listing the organization first. So let's say I'm bolding my organization title, and then underneath that, I'm going to italicize my title, describe it, and have dates listed on the right-hand side. Underneath that, so still within the same organization bolding, I'll list my second title, describe, and then add the dates over there. So either option I think can work really well, but most commonly I would see leading with the organization and probably bolding that, listing the titles underneath. And that means that you need to implement that formatting change throughout the rest of your document. So you lead with organizations on all your experiences to allow you that flexibility.
Great. There are a lot of questions here, some of which are asking for references back to particular points or particular graphics. And I will share at this point that we will share the recording of this webinar with everybody who attended today, most likely later this afternoon or tomorrow morning at the latest. So for those of you who are asking for a recap of a particular point, know that you'll be able to reference back very soon. A couple of questions about refreshing later on in your career. One person's asking, how do we avoid looking stuck if we've been in one role for a long time? Or someone also says, I'm contemplating a late mid-career shift. How do I play up extensive experience and downplay age?
Yes, yes. So thinking about kind of shifting towards a functional organization. So instead of solely basing it on experience organization, but instead thinking about skill function organization can work here. For those of you who asked this question, if you Google functional resumes, you'll have some examples of this, but I would not recommend moving fully to organizing your resume just based on skill. I would still keep those experiences organized by the position and organization you have them at. But to kind of talk through this the best that we can without a visual, I would want you to think about listing your organization and your title, and then underneath that, a skill. So maybe it's communication, and then you have bullet points underneath that. Maybe it's leadership, bullet points underneath that. So within a position, you are adding those functional details that highlight specific skills that you've had and that might relate to what you want to transition into, and take the emphasis away from I've been in this role for X amount of years, right? Like instead, I'm really highlighting the skills based on the formatting choice of calling them out intentionally. And then the other piece that's really important, and this is context for everybody that's joining the conversation, your resume, like I said at the beginning, is only one tool that you have in the application process. If you are somebody who is looking to make a change, or you are really just any applicant, the networking component, the career exploration, the relationship building component is the most efficient and effective way to operate in your job search. So you have to have a resume to apply, right? That's usually like a transactional required component. But in all cases, regardless of kind of what your career status is, I am thinking always about how can I proactively outreach about a position? How can I network with people at the organizations I'm interested in, so that my candidacy is never solely based on the information that people are interpreting from my resume draft. So if you are somebody who, again, is thinking especially about career change or have concerns about how your experience might be interpreted, I really, really even more so encourage you to incorporate that networking relationship building component so that this 1 or 2 page piece of paper is not the only thing someone knows about you.
That's a great point, and a good segue into another question that someone submitted, which was around LinkedIn profiles.
Yes.
And should they just reiterate what's on your resume, or should they be, are there any considerations that we should think about that are different from this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn gives you some delivered, like required functionality, right, of how information is organized and what order someone is going to be receiving it. We also have the added element of sort of like scan or scrollability, right, depending on how a reader is looking at your information. I think most of the principles that we've talked about today still apply in terms of content description, right? Because those descriptions are still going to be the things that you want somebody to interact with on your profile. So thinking about what you can quantify, leading with those strong verbs. And this applies for resumes and for LinkedIn, but making sure that your job titles are descriptive, right? So sometimes students will come to me and their literal title at an organization was intern, but like that doesn't tell me anything. So if their primary function was marketing, you might instead list that marketing intern. On LinkedIn especially, the number one thing you need to be mindful of is what your current title is showing as your current position or your headline on LinkedIn, which you have control over. So just be mindful that that's the first thing someone's going to see. And thinking about the formatting discussion that we've had here and applying that to LinkedIn. So your photo, your background choice really has an impact there before someone clicks into your full profile and engages with the rest of the content.
Great. A couple of questions about the education section again. For those who graduated a while ago, there's some concerns here about ageism
Sure.
and wanting to know, do you have to include the year that you graduated, how many years you've been out of school? Do you have any tips or advice on that topic?
Yeah, yep. And I know that's a big concern, again, thinking about what are the evaluations someone will make based on the information that I'm including. I think most commonly, I see date information within education sections, but if that ageism factor is a primary concern for you, again, there's no like hard and fast rules of what you have to put in your resume, right? That's one of my overall biggest points, is empowering everybody that's listening to say, I'm going to control my information. I'm going to make strategic choices. So if that's a primary concern, then perhaps you're not listing the date of your graduation. You're really emphasizing the degree that you held, and maybe your education section is the last one on your resume. You also may run into the situation where you have to apply, again, most commonly now in some sort of online portal, right? And that your graduation information is a required field, in which case you're not going to be able to get around submitting that information if that's what you were hoping to. Again, thinking about in that situation, how can networking really be the primary focus of the job search, and de-emphasizing the kind of sole relying on the resume to communicate your skills and your identity. I think that's really important. So are all the things that we talked about here, yes, you have to submit a resume, right? And we want it to be really effective, but knowing that that can't be the only tool that you're employing in your job search.
And I think that that's a great point to end our conversation on. We're coming up on our time.
Yes.
And I know that there are a lot of questions that we didn't get a chance to address. But to your point about relying on your network, I wanted to highlight a tool that the Alumni Association recently launched called the Maroon and Gold Network. And you should see the website for the Maroon and Gold Network on your screen now. And what this tool is it's a online platform for University of Minnesota students, alumni, faculty, and staff to build connections and find mentors essentially for career advice and conversations. For the alumni who are listening, you can both be a mentor to students on this platform, but you can also seek out advice from other alumni. And it's been really cool to watch this community grow. We have over 3,000 people already on the Maroon and Gold Network. And I just did a quick search. One of the help topics that alumni can indicate that they are willing to connect on is resume and cover letter help and review. And over 500 alumni have said that they're willing to connect on that topic. So if you're at the end of this conversation, if you still have questions, if you want to connect with somebody for more information, create a profile on the Maroon and Gold Network and start searching for folks that share your interests or live in your area. We're currently in over 45 states and 23 countries. And so it's a really powerful way to connect with your alumni community and get more information about this topic that's more personalized to you. I want to say a huge thank you to Tara again for presenting this topic, and to those of you who, again, we're looking for certain parts of the presentation to be refreshed, know that you'll have the recording coming your way later this afternoon or shortly thereafter. We're very thankful for you tuning in this afternoon and for our partners that make the webinar series possible. And with that, we wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.